Welcome to Murder Mile. Today, I'm standing on Elsham Road in Shepherd's Bush, W14. 3 streets north of the Labour Party Lothario. 4 streets east of the Devil's Child's home. A tube stop south of the beast last killing. And 3 streets west of the boy with the bongos who went bang. Coming soon to Murder Mile. Set on a quiet tree-lined street beside Holland Park, Elsham Road features a wealth of early Victorian 5-storey terraces in sandstone brick. It's a pretentiously middle-class street. When no one goes on holidays, they winter. Everybody has a cleaner, as they're too busy to put out their own bins. And instead of going to see their doctor, they rebalance their chakras by shoving a crystal up their jacksies. It's a street with a great sense of pretentiousness, as people try desperately hard to be who they wish they were. On the 14th of October 1941, the ground floor and basement flats at 71 Elsham Road were owned by Theodora Greenhill, a widowed mother of considerable means who was looking to sell up and to move on. That day, a convicted burglar and a homeless thief arrived on the street looking for a flat to rob. And even though he was a man who certainly didn't belong there, she let him in, and he took her life. My name is Michael. I'm your tour guide, and this is Murder Mile. Episode 261, Dr. Trevor's Greed. To say that Theodora Greenhill was an impressive woman would be an understatement. Born on the 2nd of December 1875 in Anglesey, North Wales, Theodora Jessie Weblin was raised in an era where women were barely educated, were denied a career, had less legal rights than cattle, and life dictated that their sole purpose was to cook, clean, procreate, and to tend to their husband's needs. Regardless how far from a supposedly civilized city she was raised, she couldn't vote, smoke in public, enter a pub alone, or wear trousers. And like many women, she couldn't have a bank account. She was denied a career, and even the home she lived in was her husband's property. Upon her death, the press described her solely as a widow of an army officer. But seen as a trailblazer, Theodora was so much more. As the second youngest of 4 daughters to Jessie and Walter Weblin, maybe it was her desperate need to stand out from her siblings which gave her such an independent spirit. But Theodora was different. Not content to marry simply because it was expected of her. Guided by her father's love for sport, being the co-owner of the Illustrated Sports and Dramatic News, she became passionately involved with horse racing, carriage pursuit, and later, as technology changed everyone's lives, motorsport. In the late 1890s, Theodora moved from Anglesey to London. Situated at the Ranelagh Club in Bath, South London, the Ladies' Automobile Club ran a series of driving competitions in which small, petrol-driven, horseless carriages competed in races and time trials. In an era when automobiles were seen as a fad, safety wasn't even considered, and the first Model T Ford was almost a decade away from being built. At the Ranelagh Automobile Gymkhana, held in July 1900, the First Lady's race was ran, consisting of a single lap of barely a mile long around the 130-acre site at Barnes Elms. 25-year-old Theodora Greenhill won the race in a 6-horsepower Daimler Parisian, having reached the thrilling speed of 23.7 miles an hour. Theodora was a pioneer in racing, and in her life, she was as equally independent and free-spirited. On the 9th of January 1902, she married Rupert Tattersall, and by spring of 1904, their daughter Catherine was born. But with the marriage only lasting 7 years, owing to his adultery, in 1907, a court granted her a divorce, an allowance, and the costs paid of her home at 10 Westbourne Mansions in Kensington. Now with 2 children, Virginia aged 3 and Catherine aged 6. Although a census described her as the head of the house and a woman of private means, having fallen in love with Major Herbert Greenhill of the Dorset Regiment, in the spring of 1913, they married and later had another daughter called Sylvia. As a strong, confident woman with no sense of fear, she gifted her daughters with her drive and passion, so each went on to live a rich and fulfilling life. In March 1926, following the suicide of her husband, she made the decision not to remarry, and having inherited his army pension, a widow's allowance, and with their house now legally under her name, this was where she would live for the rest of her life. By 1939, 71 Elsham Road was the perfect place for a 63-year-old widow and her youngest unmarried daughter, Sylvia. Set on a quiet middle-class street far from the bustling crowds, the two shared this maisonette with a kitchen, bathroom and a living room in the basement and the bedrooms above. And with the 3 upper floors occupied by 3 single women, the communal front door was left unlocked, as they never had any trouble with strangers. Theodora wasn't a shrinking violet who needed a man in her life. She wasn't lonely, she wasn't in need of love, and she wasn't a pushover. She was an impressive, self-reliant woman of means who was about to make a big change in her life by moving away from her home, her street, and her city. The first evacuation of London occurred during the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939. Millions fled the city, but having lived through the Zeppelin bombs of the First World War, several pandemics, an adulterous husband, being widowed, and giving birth 3 times, even after 18 months and 5 days of unrelenting blitz bombing, Theodora saw her duty to stand firm to Hitler's onslaught. But with her eldest daughters having left, and imploring their mother and youngest sibling to flee to the safety of the country, seeing it as no time for stubbornness, as the Luftwaffe continued their bombing spree of unprecedented slaughter, Theodora began packing up her belongings, and with a shortage of homes as large parts of the city were reduced to rubble, she sought out a lodger. Sladen and Stewart were the estate agents tasked with finding a well-mannered, middle-class man or woman to rent out Theodora's flat. The lodger, preferably a man with a rank or a title, but certainly someone with a noble profession, was preferred. That day, the estate agents found her a doctor. And yet the man who would murder her was nothing short of a career criminal. Harold Dorian Trevor was a 61-year-old convict who had dedicated his life to theft and lies. As a vague man with an unspecified past, little was known about his life, and few records exist to corroborate the litany of lies which passed his lips. In truth, he never had a job. His education was slim. Most of his life was spent in prison, and with no profession, what he achieved was nothing to brag about. Where he grew up was uncertain, as although he had connections to London, the north of England, and even the Welsh coastal town of Llandudno, a fake middle-class accent disguised any hints of truth. His attire gave away very few clues, as although his tall, gaunt frame alluded to his working-class roots, he dressed like a gentleman of money, wearing a fawn overcoat with a fine silk scarf. He walked with a neat walking cane. He had a monocle upon his right eye, and perched upon his thinning grey hair often sat a top hat. He came across as respectable, but the facts were far from the truth. Harold was a small-time thief, pointless and petty. He wasn't the kind of thug who would batter a bloke over the head for the sake of a bag of coins, or burst into a bank with a sawn-off shotgun. He wasn't a yob. He was a cowardly pilferer who snuck into homes when the owners were out, and used his charm to distract an old lady so he could swipe her purse from the side and then be gone before she noticed. His first offence was on the 13th of May 1896, when 15-year-old Harold Atkins, as he called himself, was bound over for stealing a purse. After that, often with weeks or even just days of being paroled, he'd steal bags, hats, gloves and purses, anything which wasn't nailed down, and always under a different alias. On the 21st of October 1899, he served his first conviction of 18 months at Pentonville Prison, followed by 18.5 years in prison across the next 20 years. Released from a 5-year stint in 1918, by the December, he had married 21-year-old Cecily Taylor. But did marriage make him a better man? No. Unwilling to work, and having got a taste for the finer things in life, by this point, he had lived the life of an imposter for so long, it was suggested he had forgotten who the real Harold Dorian was. As a man who had come from nothing, he would become something through lies and deception. With his preferred targets being mature middle-aged ladies, he would ingratiate them with his manners and his charm. He would profess to be an architect or a surgeon, and as a rank or a title in that era forgave all kinds of crimes and misdemeanors, he used many respectable aliases, like Sir Charles Warren, Lord Herbert, and Dr. Trevor. In 1919, having gravitated to stealing more expensive items, he served 5 years for jewellery theft. In 1925, he served another 5 years for cheque fraud. And in 1936, found guilty of 30 cases of larceny and deception at the Old Bailey, Harold Dorian Trevor was sent to HMP Parkhurst for another 5 years. From 1899 to 1936, in the 37 years that he'd been a criminal, he'd spent 35 of those behind bars. He wasn't great at what he did, but described as a gentleman thief. He didn't appear in any newspapers, as the items he stole were often insured, and he was far too cowardly to perpetuate any act of violence. under the palatable middle-class alias of Dr. Trevor. Being once again broke, Harold would wheedle his way into the home of Theodora Greenhill, under the ruse that he was looking for a flat to rent. But as his first ever act of violence, why would he kill her? On the 3rd of October 1941, 61-year-old Harold Dorian was released after 5 years in Parkhurst Prison. With the world reduced to rubble, it wasn't only the city which was broken and frail, so was Harold. As age had weakened his strength, bad prison food had slowed his pace, and the bluff and bluster of crap chats with cons had almost eviscerated his charm. Although he was still a man who coveted the finer things in life, his wife had disowned him, his friends were gone, and every citizen was now wary of strangers. As part of his parole, he registered with his parole officer and spent several nights at the city temperance hostel. Poverty was a dirty word to Harold Dorian, and with his dinner comprising of a watery stew and being forced to sleep on scratchy sheets in a cramped room which slept 20 assorted drunks and hobos. 3 days later, a well-spoken man booked into Fleming's Hotel on Half Moon Street, Piccadilly. He ordered a fine meal, he slept on soft sheets, and he left without paying. The next day, at the St. Martin's Hotel on Upper St. Martin's Lane, a Mr. Trevor did the same. Living off a handout of just 10 shillings a week, on Tuesday the 7th of October, 6 days before the murder, he was told to report to the Labour Exchange to find himself a job. But what job could he do? He was a 61-year-old greedy ex-con who hadn't done an honest day's work in his entire life. So unable to go straight, he did what he knew. On Thursday the 9th of October at 11:30 a.m, a Mr. H.D. Trevor called to the estate agents of Harrods and said to be
looking for a flat for myself and my daughter.
An appointment was made with the owner. Arriving at 8 Sloane Street in Knightsbridge, as the impressive residence of wealthy widow Mrs. Bertha Haydock, he rang the doorbell. He politely greeted this lone woman with a reassuringly soft voice. As was good manners, he handed her a visiting card which listed him as Dr. Trevor. And as they chatted, this seemingly respectable man browsed the rooms as his eyes wandered over the items he would steal. At around 12 p.m, he asked,
"May I bother you for a glass of water?"
And with her heading to the kitchen to fulfill his request, telling her,
"I'm just going to see if my daughter has arrived,"
he left. 5 minutes later, as he hadn't returned, she went in search of him. It was only then that she realized that her handbag was missing, inside of which was a purse, a checkbook, and a diamond ring. That was his technique. A little charm, a deposit, an honest distraction, an excuse, a snatch, and a hasty retreat. By Monday the 13th of October, he'd spent every penny he'd stolen from Bertha. So using the same ruse, at 2 p.m, Dr. Trevor arrived at Sladen and Stewart estate agents and was given 4 addresses, all within walking distance. 42 Holland Road, 6 Norland Square, 9 St James's Gardens, and 71 Elsham Road. Tuesday the 14th of October 1941 was typical of most days, as a little light drizzle had tempered the fires after a night of bombardment. In the ground and basement flat of 71 Elsham Road, 65-year-old Theodora Greenhill was packing up for her move, lugging heavy boxes with ease, all while immaculately dressed. With her daughter Sylvia and the ladies in the flats above out, Theodora was alone when the doorbell rang. Dr. Trevor?
Indeed, madam. Here is my card.
Oh, please do come in. As by appointment, at 11 a.m. sharp, she let in the top-hatted and monocled guest into her home. To her, he seemed polite, frail, and harmless. His middle-class accent was affected by a regional twang, but with both of them having been partially raised in North Wales, so was hers. And although his attire made him stand out, his calm mannerisms and uncomplicated ways made him easily forgettable. It didn't bother her as she showed the stranger around her flat, and it didn't seem odd as his eyes spied her possessions on display. As alone, she walked him from room to room. He was as unthreatening as melting ice, and in comparison, she was a forthright ex-racing driver who, if she had to, could put up a fight. Harold claimed,
I agreed to rent it for 3.5 guineas a week. She excused herself and went down to the basement to write a receipt.
Having left him alone for a few minutes in the drawing room, within swiping distance of his sticky fingers lay a pair of gold ring longets, a checkbook, a handbag, and some treasury notes.
I wanted to steal them, but didn't,
he said. Then his memory went blank.
For a reason I can't fathom,
He would claim.
I took an empty wine bottle from the hall
And snuck down to the basement. Facing the wall, Theodora was standing at her writing bureau, as with a fountain pen in her hand, she wrote him a receipt, which read, Received from Dr. H.D. Trevor, the sum of... It was then that the glass wine bottle smashed into 27 pieces, which knocked her out cold. But with no skull fractures and no brain damage, she was bleeding, but still alive and breathing. He'd never hurt a woman before, until now. But why? Was it desperation or greed? Harold would claim,
I suddenly found myself seated in the downstairs kitchen.
And yet, in a state of supposed delirium, he ransacked her bureau, found a cash box, took the 3.5 guineas he'd given her as a deposit, and then he went searching for more. Over the next 2 hours, as Theodora lay motionless, as if this was his last ever heist, he took the large trunk she'd just begun packing and loaded it with whatever goodies his greedy little mitts could grab, such as 2 fur coats, several silk dresses and slips, a metal clock, a bottle of bay rum, 2 rings, 2 handbags, 5 brooches, a portmanteau case, 7 handkerchiefs, and even a sponge, totalling just under £100, or £5,900 today. He was methodical, as he took anything of any value. But it was then that something would spook him. At 12:33 p.m, Sylvia called to see how the appointment with Dr. Trevor went. Only her mother didn't pick up. At 2 p.m, Catherine called. As returning from New York that day, she planned to drop by later, only likewise the phone went unanswered. And with Sylvia calling again at 2:10 p.m, as Catherine was concerned. Sometime during these hours, with a woolen stocking, Harold choked the life out of her. He'd claim he couldn't remember strangling her, just as he couldn't recall putting a handkerchief over her face to stop her glaring eyes from staring, as they remained as fixed and open as her gaping mouth. In a swift split-second decision, the thief had become a murderer for the sake of a few items which would barely last him a month. But arrogance can be a powerful fuel to the fires of greed. So as her body lay limp, he hailed a taxi, got 2 labourers to help him with the trunk, and he headed to King's Cross Station. Catherine arrived at 2:30 p.m, just minutes after the killer had fled. And as she entered the flat, she screamed, finding her mother dead. Being as emotionally cold as the corpse he'd left behind, Harold didn't once think about his actions. By the station, he pawned off a wedding ring for £2 and 5 shillings and fled to Birmingham, where he stayed at the Midland Hotel, sleeping on silk sheets, gorging on 5-course meals, and ordering room service. Dressed in a new suit, a bow tie, and a trilby hat, he sold off the rest of her items at an antiques dealer in Moseley, as well as a portmanteau case etched with Theodora's initials. And under several aliases, he stayed at the Royal Hotel in Sutton Coldfield, the Carmel Hotel in Colwyn Bay, and the Rothbury Hotel in the Welsh town of Llandudno, a place he seemed to have fond memories of from his distant childhood. Arriving at 3:10 p.m, the investigation was headed up by Detective Chief Inspector William Salisbury. The murder of Theodora Greenhill would be as swift as any crime he'd solved before. With a trunk of possessions missing, the motive was robbery. With no defensive wounds, the attack was swift, silent, and unprovoked. And although the name he used was an alias, his identity wasn't exactly a mystery. On the desk, although bafflingly, he'd spent 4 hours ransacking the flat. He'd left behind the receipt she was writing, which read, "Received from Dr. H.D. Trevor." Upon the same desk was his visiting card in the name of Dr. H.D. Trevor, which was one of the aliases he'd used during his prior convictions. When questioned, the taxi driver, the estate agents, and the labourers who dubbed him with the trunk all described him 6 foot tall, slim build, grey short hair, with a scar over his left eye, and on 15 shattered fragments of the wine bottle which he'd used to stun Theodora, They'd found fingerprints for a 61-year-old burglar, thief, conman, and now murderer called Harold Dorian Trevor. With his details issued to the press and the police, 4 days later, he was spotted in Llandudno. P.C. Thomas had only been a reserve policeman for 2 weeks. He was so new to the job that he didn't even have a uniform. But recognizing the suspect from a news article that he'd read just that morning, he apprehended him at a phone kiosk on Queen Street. And the so-called Dr. Trevor was charged with murder. Tried at the Old Bailey, Harold pleaded not guilty to murder. Across the 2-day trial, being a born liar, he would claim that he was never there. He would vehemently deny strangling her. He would plead total memory loss. He would state that he was certified insane, aged 13. He would ask for the case to be dismissed, owing to malpractice by his own lawyers. And he even accused the police of getting him drunk on the train to London and demanding that his confession be inadmissible as evidence. For his baffling defense, he gave a list of witnesses who would prove his alibi, none of who could be found. And although he presented as mentally unstable, Dr. Greers, the senior medical officer of Brixton Prison, gave evidence that although his behaviour was erratic,
he was sane and fit to stand trial.
On the 29th of January 1942, having been sentenced to death, ever the egotist, he professed to the court,
I sincerely hope that each one of you gentlemen of the jury will remember these words. These words are, that you receive a greater measure of mercy that has never been meted out to me in this world. I am not afraid of anyone, or of what anyone can do. My life, up to the age of 62, has been all winter.
Held at Wandsworth Prison, with his appeal having been rejected, he sent numerous letters to the Home Secretary, complaining about his unfair treatment, his bed and his cell, ending his petition with,
I have not touched my food for 24 hours, and I have barely snatched 8 hours of sleep in nearly 5 weeks.
Never once expressing any remorse for his crimes, any compassion for his victims, or an apology to Theodora's family.